Good morning, everybody. This is Terry Helpin from the Coalition for Compassionate Care of Ventura County. I am glad to see you, and I am very glad that the sun is shining, though it may be hot, and that we're able to meet together, and that life is actually going well in some ways, though many of us are perceiving some very negative news, and things are hard, continuing to be hard in different ways. So it's good to meet with friends and familiar faces and to be able to talk about things that mean much to us in our personal lives. And today we're going to talk about something that people avoid. And I was reading an article in Wired, a past issue of Wired, that my husband turned me on to Wired, and it's got a lot of different good articles into it. He turned me on a medical article, and then I looked at the rest of it, and I've started reading Wired for a couple of years. And this past issue was an article, a short one-page article on these notifications are killing me. And it's about an app that people downloaded that remind them that they are not going to live forever. And this person writes the internet, the cloud, and says, "Dear ping to death." And the internet answers back, "I don't think there's something wrong with you, or rather, you seem to be suffering from a problem that is endemic to the whole of humankind. A species with an almost limitless ability to live in denial of the one inevitability. Even explicit reminders of our demise, we want to deny." So we do have a habit of not wanting to explore the idea that we're dying. We happen to be kind of odd people in our communities, unless we happen to be young and goth. So we're going to explore, what do we do? Because we know we are going to die, and we have to plan. We should be making plans, and we don't do that. We avoid it. I personally attended to my parents' postmortems. It was 18 years ago, and found it a gift that they had thought ahead. Many of us don't think ahead. I am thinking about thinking ahead, but we haven't made those plans yet. And I know how vital it could be. So today I'm going to introduce somebody who is very intimately involved with the planning for death. And she's familiar to all of us. In fact, the other day I had spoke with somebody regarding and came across, her name is Lynette Coverly, and she knows Jennifer and spoke highly of her. And Jennifer Finnerty is the Director of Business Development and Community Relations for Rose Family Funeral Home and Cremation, a local family-owned funeral home in Simi Valley since 1992. Previously, Jennifer worked as an executive director for a local hospice foundation and spent 17 years with the American Cancer Society as a community missions director. Jennifer has lived in Ventura County, or Ventura, her entire life, and is the proud mom of 2 daughters and 3 grandchildren. And I found out one of those grandbabies is a 9-month-old baby. It is my pleasure to let Jennifer take the floor now. And I would ask everybody that you would be ready with your questions and your comments, and that we would hopefully have a discussion from this.
Okay, well, good morning. Thank you so much for having me here, Terry, and the group. Sorry that it's still virtual, and I hope that just me sitting as a talking head in your window is not too boring, and I hope that it's informative to you. And if you have any questions at any point, I'd be happy to entertain those. Terry asked me to talk about a couple of topics today, one being the importance of funerals, and then the top 10 funeral trends for 2022, kind of what we're looking at, what we're seeing is happening. So it was really fun to actually do a lot of research on this, and kind of relate it to the experience here at the mortuary. So I'll start with the importance of funerals. I think especially during the last 2 years, during the pandemic, we saw virtually a period of time where funerals were almost non-existent. They were what I would call stripped down. I remember like we would watch on our cameras all of our families in the back like hugging, and we were like, they're hugging, which was so odd because obviously everyone hugs, right? That's like one expression of grief and compassion to someone who's lost someone. So we were in that period of time where hugs weren't even safe and funerals were socially distant affairs. But I do think coming past those last 2 years, we really saw why funerals are important. And everyone's different, right? I was just reading my mom's trust over the weekend, to be honest, and her written notes are that she does not want to have a funeral. And the lack of coming together to grieve does have long-term consequences. Long after the passing occurs. And when someone passes, the funeral is not for them. The funeral, it's about them, but the funeral is for everyone who knew, loved, and was connected to the person who died. And they are fundamental to processing grief. They're fundamental to how we mourn, how we grieve, how we reinforce social ties, and how to expand the social safety net in times of vulnerability and loss. And they also reflect what it means for us to be human and for us to love and for us to connect. And funerals allow us to come together for support and start us on the path to healing. And they include rituals that are our symbolic experiences that help us come together with our family and friends, express our deepest thoughts and feelings about life's most important events. Similarly to how we celebrate, birthday parties, honoring the passing of another year of life, or weddings, publicly affirming, a private love shared by two people. So funerals are really important experiences. When someone we love dies, our hearts and minds rebel against it. Certainly at first, we just cannot accept that that person is gone. It's very hard. One day they're here, one day they're not. And the first purpose of a funeral is to help accept that the death is a reality. And in order for us to heal and grieve or start to heal and grieve, we must first accept what has happened. One of the other key components of a funeral is remembering the one who has died. We see this happen in a eulogy, a tribute video, songs, readings, gathering of friends and family. This is where we begin the process of moving our relationship with the one who has died to one of a memory rather than one of presence. And the third purpose is to activate and receive support, right? So it really allows all those people to come together and just pour out support for the widow or the brother or the sister or the family member, the friend, whoever they have lost. Funerals are a safe place for us to get our thoughts and emotions out. By putting those out there into action, we begin the journey. And grieving really is a journey, and you guys all know that, but grieving really is a journey. And when someone dies, I think many questions begin to surface. Did they live a good life? What is the meaning of life? Is my life on purpose? And there's no simple answers. A funeral gives us time and opportunity to ask them and begin to find our way to answers that prompt us into action and find peace. Funerals help us find a new self-identity sometimes. They help us publicly mark a change in status. For instance, if a widow loses their spouse, it helps with their new identity, that their spouse is gone and they're going to move forward as a single person. Secondly, funerals wake up and make us think about our own lives and how we want to spend our remaining days. And I know that's certainly true for me here. There's never a family that I don't work with where I think about what I am doing, is it significant enough? Am I making that much of a difference? Because I do want, my life to have meaning for other people. And funerals are not about closure. It's really just about starting that grieving process. So, and then thought I would talk a little bit about why funeral planning makes sense. And if we were looking at this on a screen, sense would be like the dollar sign sense. But these are like the top 10 things of what, we feel why pre-planning and doing an advanced healthcare directive or filling out your 5 wishes, why all of that makes sense. It's peace of mind, first and foremost. Knowing your wishes in advance will ease the burden on your loved ones. It's financial security. Pre-funding eliminates the stress associated with funeral expenses. There's an option to pay over time. With pre-funding, you can set aside and pay in convenient periodic amounts. It's a known price. It's outlining your funeral plans in advance, allows your family to know what the cost will be. It also locks in the cost. So we've really seen that in I would say the last year. I was just quoted this last week. Fox Business News contacted us for a quote, and it came out over the weekend, an article about how the current economy is affecting the cost of funerals. So one really great idea is to prepay and pre-plan your own funeral, because you do lock in today's costs. And funeral pre-planning is transferable if you move out of state or simply choose another funeral home. If you've changed your mind, your advanced plan can transfer with you. Just had a lady call me from yesterday. She did her pre-need here at Rose Family. She now lives in Idaho. So I was helping her with her new funeral home in Idaho, transfer her plan to Idaho. Together and not alone. Your loved ones won't be left to make all the decisions on their own as to what you might have wanted. So really important. A lot of families come in here and they're like, well, we don't really know what our mom wanted. She didn't talk about this. And it's really stressful for families to make those kinds of decisions. So again, when you do all these things ahead of time, all of that is documented, and it really eases the burden. And when the passing occurs, it's one call. Once you have pre-planned, the single call sets that process in motion. I'm working with a lady, a DPOA yesterday, and her loved one passed, and everything, I pulled the file there, everything is there. I just had to fill in the date of death and the time of death and some things that obviously we wouldn't know ahead of time. But other than that, everything is ready to go. And then, of course, personalization. You're really allowed to, pre-planning allows you to choose how you want your life to be celebrated and how you want to be remembered. And then I thought I would talk about the top 10 funeral trends for 2022. So there's a little bit of movement in this area. The funeral industry is probably the one industry that doesn't change a whole lot. But certainly in the last few years, we've seen a lot of change. So I thought I would talk about that. Online planning and purchasing is huge right now. Fully digitized funeral arrangements, replacing the traditional face-to-face arrangement with virtual meetings, remote consultations, and completing all of the paperwork via DocuSign. So we had this in place here prior to the pandemic, but it was a game changer during the pandemic, because we couldn't see anyone inside the funeral home for several of those months. As you all know, everything was closed. So we can meet with people virtually, by Zoom, by just telephone call, and then we can send everything to them via DocuSign. Certainly there are some people who just can't do the technology. And so I remember taking a folding chair out to the parking lot and just meeting with somebody like 5 feet apart in the parking lot, doing their arrangements out there. So, but we kind of live in a techie world, right? Consumers now expect to purchase almost anything with a few clicks. And certainly we have been able to adapt that here. So online planning and purchasing and fully digitized arrangements are here to stay. Um, One of the other trends we're seeing is active participation. And as an example, I would use washing and dressing of their loved one's body. So we just had a family in here yesterday. They were a Muslim family, and their culture calls for a washing and a dressing and a private prayer. So we're seeing families that want to actively participate um, with this process. So another thing families want to do is witness cremations, and also cultures. The Hindu culture, in particular, likes to witness their loved ones' cremations. I can tell you locally, it's I think I have 2 locations that allow witness cremations. There were more, but prior to the pandemic, but during the pandemic, those had to be closed or shut down, and they have not reopened. So some people really want to do that. Some people, the thought of that is just not for them, but some people really do want to witness that cremation and actually push the button on the retort for the cremation process to start. We're seeing families sprinkle soil over their caskets. That's a very traditional ritual with the Jewish faith. And they sprinkle a little bit of soil on their loved one's casket. And then some families want to assist cemeteries with digging the actual graves. So not all cemeteries will let you do that, but some will. So that's something that we're seeing more of, is active participation. Online grief support and grief counseling. I mean, I'm sure you guys have all seen that, right? Everything has moved to online. And we had an in-person grief support here prior to the pandemic. Then we went virtual during the pandemic. And then our attendance really dropped off. I'm actually starting to get a lot more calls about that again. So we're going to begin to relook at that. But online grief support, and honestly, I don't know what I would do without Livingston, because all of my referrals now are going to Livingston for their grief resources. So we are very appreciative, because I always like to be able to refer a family somewhere that I feel good about. So alternatives to cremation. So that's another thing that we're seeing in terms of trends. You guys might have heard about space burial launches, remains near space, Earth orbit, the lunar surface, or beyond. That is something that is now happening, and the costs. I think we've had one person here who inquired about that and did that. Cost really depends on the experience chosen, but it ranges. It's not cheap. It ranges between 3,000 and 15,000. But quite honestly, I mean, some funerals can be in that higher range of that, depending upon what the family chooses. So cost wise, it's not that out of the picture. We're also seeing a trend in memory glass. So memory glasses, I should have pulled one and put it in front of me, but it's a really beautiful orb that remains are fused into. So we're seeing a lot of families do that. And it's hand spun, and it comes in a variety of colors. And then there is a newer lab in New Mexico that transforms cremated remains into smooth stones that can be distributed among loved ones, versus just having that urn of cremated remains, the traditional urn of cremated remains. Another trend that we're seeing is live stream services, right? This is something that we did so much of during the pandemic, like webcasting, Facebook Live, YouTube. So that is something that's definitely here to stay. We just upgraded our system to Boxcast. So it's just, the quality is just perfect. And, I mean, funerals happen, and not everyone can attend them, especially loved ones, family members, friends from out of state or from distances far away. So that live stream option is something that's definitely here to stay. And there's been some issues with Facebook Live. If there's some music that's played that's copyrighted, Facebook will immediately shut that service down, or nobody can watch it or listen to it. YouTube will do the same thing. So box casting is safer. And this trend has provided comfort to many and is expected to become a standard offering of funeral homes moving forward. And certainly it is here. Another trend that we're seeing is green burials. There are numerous reasons why people may choose a natural burial, some of which may have been addressed above. However, for those who lean towards more conventional funeral practices because they like the idea of the body breaking down in the ground, it is important to note that there is no scientific or other evidence that a sealing, casket, or embalming will preserve human remains. We actually just did a what we call a disinterment. We did it about 3 months ago at a local funeral home, at a local cemetery, excuse me. And this family was moving out of state and they did not want their loved one to stay here. So they paid for their loved one to be disinterred. And it had been, it was in 1986 that that person was buried. And and they were embalmed at that time. And it was really amazing to see how intact that body stays after all those years. So some people don't like that idea. They really like the idea of their loved one disintegrating naturally into the earth. And when someone's embalmed, that at least they really do almost stay totally intact. So green burial means without embalming, nature takes its course sooner rather than later. And I was just going to give you some statistics on like annually in the United States, we bury over 827,000 gallons of embalming fluid, which includes formaldehyde, 180,000 pounds of steel in caskets, 5.4 million pounds of copper and bronze in caskets, and 3 million board feet of hardwood in caskets. So, you know, when you think about all those things going into the ground, especially if we're trying to be good to the earth, then green burial is an option that people are choosing. Locally, we have two options. We have Joshua Tree Memorial Park, which really isn't that local, but if you're familiar, Joshua Tree is one memorial park and it's not inexpensive. It's about $6,400 to bury your loved one there naturally in a green environment. And then we have Woodlawn Cemetery in Malibu. They are a green or natural burial form, and they only use decomposable caskets. So we just buried someone there recently, and they were buried in a wicker casket. So that breaks down naturally into the earth, and no embalming fluids are used. Nothing, everything has to be non-toxic. So that's another trend that we're seeing is green burial. People do call about that. And so those are the two options that we frequently use that we feel the best about. Terry asked me to talk about columbariums a little bit. I don't know if everyone knows what a columbarium is, but it's a concrete wall with several recessed niches, commonly referred to as a columbarium niche. And they're used to hold cremation urns. And the covers are typically constructed of marble or granite, and that's often engraved. So most of the cemeteries have a columbarium area. And I think some families think that that's a more formal, less expensive arrangement for their loved one, but it quite honestly is not less expensive. So versus like burial at the cemetery. So just something to think about. And then I think lastly, I'm going to touch on actually two last things: body donation and tissue and organ donation. Body donation is something that I was just talking to Terry about earlier. We do not get a lot of families inquiring about that. But locally, the UCLA, the David School of Medicine has a whole body donation program. And that program underwrites all costs associated with the removal, preservation, and disposition of your loved one if you chose that program. This should be indicated on your advanced healthcare directive. And to be accepted into their program, all vital organs must be intact. You can donate your corneas and still be a donor, but all vital organs do need to be intact. You will not need the services of a funeral home if you choose to donate your body to science. So that is a cost savings, obviously. Students of medicine will study these bodies in an anatomy laboratory course, as well as surgical resident training. Bodies are also made available for research purposes in a variety of fields. And following research, UCLA uses an eco-friendly water cremation technology, and remains are spread at sea. Remains cannot be returned, so that is something that families, I think, oftentimes don't want to donate their loved one's whole body to the program and they don't get any remains back. So remains cannot be returned to the families, and there's no pathological reports, findings, or details of specific studies that are shared with the family. And body donors must be free of infectious diseases such as HIV, AIDS, hepatitis B and C, etc. And donors cannot weigh more than 250 pounds. And UCLA has donor programs throughout California. They have 5 different sites. So we have one here pretty close to us. And the other thing I was going to talk about that came up in the whole body donation program is the water cremation that is now legal in California, which of course is an alternative to the typical flame cremation. I'm not sure about the, I don't know, just because of the water crisis that we're in, it takes like 400,000 gallons of water for one water cremation. So I'm not really sure what that's going to look like moving forward, but something that is legal now. And we do have one site in California. Tissue and organ donation. We get a lot of questions about that. And that is something also that you would want to have on your advanced healthcare directive. Tissue donation must be initiated within 24 hours of a person's death. In most cases, One Legacy contacts the funeral home, informs us that the deceased may be a candidate for tissue or organ donation. So what that means for us is that we do not start any embalming or preparation process until we hear back from One Legacy or the family that the deceased would like to move forward. So we bring them into our care. They're placed into immediate refrigeration, which they are anyway. And then we wait to hear from One Legacy or the family if they're going to move forward. Unlike organs, donated tissues can be processed and stored for an extended period of time. Donated tissues can be used in burn cases, ligament repairs, bone replacements, and to help with other serious medical conditions. So harvests usually take place either here at the mortuary, or One Legacy will pick up the deceased, take them to their facility, do the harvest, and bring the loved one back here. The most commonly transplanted tissues are bones, tendons, ligaments, skin, heart valves, blood vessels, and corneas. And again, if the deceased had certain conditions like HIV or an actively spreading cancer or a severe infection, that would exclude them from organ donation. So that's all I have for today. I certainly can take any questions if anybody has any questions that I could answer or something you've always wanted to ask. I'm happy to answer.
I'd like to say that's all. That was a lot of information.
I know. Sorry, I feel like just a talking head. So,
So is there anybody who has a particular question they'd like to ask at this point? and you're all muted, so you might have to unmute to do that. Oh, so I put a question in the chat, Jennifer, for pre-needs. And have you noticed that, I noticed as a hospice nurse that the pre-needs and the planning and were very beneficial at that time. But say I'm normally a relatively healthy adult, and to have my pre-needs set up now, how would that look different than a hospice patient?
So the state of California does not let us accept funds ahead of passing if that person is what we call imminent or expected to pass within the next 30 days. So it's illegal for a funeral home to take in those funds. So a pre-need for someone who's imminent within 30 days, we cannot do. But we all know that people live on hospice a lot longer than that. So if the passing is not expected within the next 30 days, certainly their family or they can come in and take care of their pre-need.
So let's talk emotional. Have you noticed, is there a difference? Does anybody know? And we have people who can be involved in this conversation. I know Denise, Pauline, involved in hospice. Is there a difference emotionally for the family, for the patients, or for people to have the pre-needs done as opposed to not?
I can tell you the one thing that we hear almost every day here is a family will call us and say, my loved one was just put on hospice and the nurse said, or the social worker said, that we absolutely have to have a pre-arrangement done. And they're almost frantic. I just had a call the other day, I think it was Friday. They were almost frantic about it. And I was like, I mean, certainly you can come in, we can have a conversation. You can fill out the paperwork ahead of time if you want to do that. We can put it in a file for you here for when the passing does occur. But there is nothing they absolutely need to do with us ahead of time. And we feel that their time is better served spending those last remaining days with their loved one who's sick. But if they really want to do that, then they certainly can come in and do that. It really depends on the emotions of the person. Some people want to plan ahead and get it all done and feel better in their mind having it done. And of course, they can come and do that. And then some people, they're like, oh, I'm so glad you said that, because I really thought I had to get this done now. And I said, you don't have to get this done now. What I think your hospice is asking is they're asking for which mortuary you've chosen and their phone number. So you will want to give them the name and phone number of the mortuary you choose. So once we kind of have that conversation, then that seems to put most people at ease.
Yes, the communication factor.
Yeah, if I could just say, I mean, in my experience, in terms of helping people with their estate planning, if people take care of their own arrangements, it removes that emotion and that stress from the family at the time of death. And especially, maybe not especially, but at least, especially if, when somebody's on hospice, you have some sense that they're going to be dying, in some period of time. And sometimes it's very sudden for people who are not on hospice. And I just know it's a lot easier when everything is taken care of, because then they can focus on other things.
Yeah.
Yep.
And personally, I know that when that person dies suddenly, you're in this, it's a state that you can't explain unless you've been there, of your ability to think, to function, to even swallow. And yet now you have to deal with funeral process, and to have somebody have magically done it is a gift, because now you can focus on the other things that are important. So yeah, it's true. Very, very true. I have a couple of questions, and they have to do with cremation. And can you explain more what a water cremation is?
Yes. So it's virtually the same process as flame cremation, except there's no flame and it's very hot water. So it's done in the same kind of retort that a traditional fire cremation takes place in, but it's done through 400,000 gallons of very hot water.
So, yeah, when I researched it, I didn't see it was that much water,
Mm,
but they do use the salination. So
they
there's a
do.
high
It's a very,
percentage.
yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, they do. And so it's thought to be more green, right? Because it doesn't use, some people feel that fire cremation pollutes the air when it comes out of the retort into the air. So water cremation is thought to be more green. But I don't know, it just the amount of water that it takes. And it does use, as you said, a small percentage of the chemical with it.
Yeah. So Archbishop Tutu chose to have aquamation.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
which brought it to my eyes and went, well, that's kind of interesting. And then Carlo asked, are there time consideration differences between green cremation and traditional cremation?
No, same. Yeah. Meaning one doesn't take longer than another, I think is his question, right?
Yeah. So did I miss this? Did you speak about green cremation versus traditional cremation? And my brain
No,
went
green
on vacation.
burial. Yeah,
Green burial,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
So in Conejo Mountain doesn't do green burial?
Not that we've ever done there, and not that I'm aware of. And when I did my research, they did not come up.
Oh, that's interesting.
Mhm.
As I know they do all the other special burials of Muslim, Jewish,
Yes.
Orthodox.
Yeah.
Talking about Orthodox way back when one of the major fires, I attended an Orthodox funeral,
Mhm.
and I don't want to use the word amazing in that way, but it was so different than a Christian funeral.
Mhm. Mhm.
Really moved my heart. It was my husband's good
Mhm.
friend's mother, and the tradition of that is very moving,
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
sincerity that was there.
Yeah.
So it brings back that reality that we are human and that we do have a time limit, and how close that is to us. So it was very moving. I was taught now that if I made my funeral preparations here, my plans, that I can move that to Michigan if I move where my daughter
Mhm.
lives.
Mhm.
I had no idea that was a possibility.
Yeah, so what you're going to do is contact the other funeral home in Michigan and make sure that they would accept your pre-plan from whatever company you have it from. So the lady that I helped yesterday, we just went on a Google search. I looked at the most highest rated family-owned funeral home in the area she was moving to, and I said, why don't you give them a call? Their Google reviews are very high, and they're family-owned, which I always feel is better than a corporately owned funeral home. And she called them and they said they would be happy to accept her plan. So then I just faxed over all of her paperwork from here.
And then why, this is something I don't understand, maybe somebody else does. 1986, why move a body?
So they were leaving the state. They didn't want their loved one to stay here. So we disinterred their loved one and then did a ship out to the state they were moving to, and they were going to rebury their loved one there.
Isn't that extremely costly?
Very. Not so much on our end, but on the cemetery side, because cemeteries have fees called opening and closing. So and in this case, when someone's buried, you have to use a huge piece of equipment to dig the vault out, which is very heavy. So
And there are laws for transferring between states.
yeah,
Correct?
you have to have a transit permit. So we filed all that paperwork to do that for them.
And do they fly?
Uh-huh.
Okay.
Yep, they're shipped by cargo.
So are there laws that go with the cremation remains too?
From state to state?
Mhm.
country to country, yes. Um, Domestically, it's much easier to if your loved one's cremated remains are here and you're going to fly them to another state, you just carry them on just like you would when you carry on any other piece of luggage. But you do not check them in your check bag. You carry them on, and they will pull you aside at TSA and do a special search and check the permit, and then you can go forward. So that's very easy. And all of our urns are TSA approved here that we travel with. Internationally is a different different set of rules, and each country is different. So we have to do a lot of consulate paperwork for international transfer of remains. It takes a lot of time. It's very cumbersome. It's all done by literally have to send staff down to the consulate. Like there's nothing electronic with the consulates. So it's a lot, it's time intensive, staff intensive, and it costs the families about $500 for us to do all that paperwork for them.
Wow.
Who knew
So,
this was all so complicated?
No, truly. Someone says it's complicated to die, and that's the truest statement. The truest
So,
statement.
I missed the very beginning of the meeting, but I would like to hear your recommendation on when people should do their funeral planning. You know, us as individuals, when should we do our funeral planning? And
now. Seriously, while you're well and know what you want, and it's not, I mean, sometimes for some families, when they start talking about it with their loved ones because they become sick, maybe, and then want to start talking about it, the family doesn't want to talk about it. So we always recommend that, just like we talk about everyone over the age of 18 should have an advanced healthcare directive, you should do your pre-planning now is the smartest time. Especially because costs are rising.
yeah, that's what I understand as well.
Mhm.
I just know, I agree with what Terry said. I just know my parents did theirs, and to not have to deal with any of that at the time of their death and have it all laid out was such a blessing to us.
Yeah, we always say it's like the final gift, really, that you can give your family that's left, because that loss is so deep. So just not having to think about those arrangements is so helpful. And a lot of families are torn apart by it. Like family members don't see eye to eye on how things should be taken care of or handled. So it can get really messy as well. So
If you do it, let's say we do it, you know, younger, and then something happens and we move elsewhere, but we've already bought a plot or we've already bought something locally. How does that work? Can you then sell it or?
So cemetery plots are bought and sold all the time. Things change or people move or so you can sell that. We work with one particular cemetery plot broker that we really trust and feel confident that our families use. We almost always refer our families when they're looking for a plot to purchase to go through the broker instead of through the cemetery. It's usually about half the cost.
Wow.
So yes.
Wow.
So if you've pre-planned your arrangements and then things change, you move, those are fully transferable as long as you find a funeral home that will accept it. If you have purchased property, you can certainly sell that property. And honestly, in California, cemetery property is real estate, literally. It's just as costly as real estate is here. It's so expensive to bury here in California. It's wildly expensive, just the cemetery property alone.
So to do a green burial would be in Joshua Tree, or would be in Malibu, did you say?
Woodlawn, Woodlawn
Woodlawn.
Cemetery.
So their costs are comparable, it sounds like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do
Yeah.
you have an idea of what that is?
For green burial for those?
Yeah.
Joshua Tree, I think starts about 6,400, and Woodlawn I had trouble on their website figuring out what the cost of their green burial was, which is, to be honest, illegal because every mortuary in the state of California has to have a general price list on their website. And I had trouble, I found their GPL, but I could not find their green burial pricing. But we just buried somebody there in that wicker casket, and it was about $20,000.
For the burial site, and that's the
Mhm,
burial site in
mhm.
Joshua is 6,400.
64, starts about 64.
Wow. So that's an amazing thing. I will tell you,
Mhm.
you talked about columbariums. My Episcopal church has a columbarium in the church in our Mary Chapel, and they just raised the cost from 1,000 to 1,200 for a columbarium cube.
Mhm. That's
So
pretty
pretty
well
reasonable.
priced.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just had a sweet family bury their son, or going to put him in the columbarium at Conejo Mountain, and I think it was $7,000.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and my husband has now decided that he does not want to be cremated. He wants to have a green burial.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that's his latest idea. So
Yeah.
we have. So let me ask this then: when you make your pre-plan and you're working with the
Mhm.
mortuary, we work with Rose or whomever.
Mhm.
Then do you have to decide on where the body goes at the time of that pre-plan?
Do you mean where it goes in terms of final resting place?
Correct.
Um, you don't have to, but you're going to want to, because if you don't, then if your passing occurs, then that decision will be left up to somebody else. So it's to your benefit to do that.
Okay, but they are not necessarily 100% connected. So you could make the pre-plan the decision as like my parents did without making the choice of the resting place.
Yes.
And
Yeah, especially
that
if you're comfortable leaving your family to make that decision.
okay.
Yeah.
So that's important to know. I didn't know you could do them
Mhm.
separately.
Mhm.
Wow.
Yeah, most people don't understand that the mortuary and the cemetery are two separate entities. So sometimes people will call the cemetery first, and the cemetery will say, "We're happy to bury your loved one here, but you're going to have to engage the services of a mortuary." And conversely, if you come to the mortuary first and you just want direct cremation or cremation, then we can handle everything. But if you want to be buried somewhere, then you're going to have to engage a cemetery. So we obviously work hand in hand and make all those arrangements for the family, but people don't realize that there are costs on both sides of that.
That's important. So let's say Ivy Lawn, which is a crematory and a graveyard, cemetery,
Cemetery.
and also a funeral planning, correct?
Correct.
But they will accept people into their cemetery that you have done the pre-plans for.
Yes.
Okay, that's also
Yes.
important to understand.
Yes. Yeah, and you can, the benefit of doing this ahead of time is you can shop around, right? And really find out. I mean, you can use Ivy Lawn in its entirety if you want to, or you can use another mortuary and just have and be buried at Ivy Lawn and Cemetery. So if cost is an important thing, then you can, shop around and find the best price. We are cheaper, as an example, for the mortuary's services than Ivy Lawn is. So if cost is important, then that's a benefit of doing things ahead of time.
Wow. And it is, and as I was doing hospice care, I knew cost was very important to many people.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yeah. So, wow. Any other questions?
What would you say? I'm just curious about this because I've been asked a couple of times. Average cost to when someone dies, if you just had an average cost of what it would be to bury someone if they didn't have any special requests or that kind of thing.
I would say average cost would be about $7,000.
Okay.
And that also differs widely because every cemetery is so different in their pricing. So you really want to like look ahead of time at that, you know? The cemetery that we probably use the most, which is Oakwood Memorial Park in Chatsworth here, is probably the most expensive cemetery. But that's, if the families choose that, then the families choose that. So, but there are other cemeteries that are more reasonably priced than them. But I would say about 7,000.
And does that include the real estate? Does that include the burial plot if you're being buried?
No, that does not.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and, you know, mortuaries have, it's such an interesting field because you would think it would be much more highly regulated than it is. At least I always think that. But the pricing of mortuaries varies greatly, and cemeteries. So I know often here, people will say to us, can you just explain why you're so much less expensive than XYZ that I just talked to? It almost makes people feel like we're not doing something right, or do you know what I mean? So the business philosophy of Rose Family is entirely different than any other mortuary in this county. So we answer that question a lot. Why are you so much cheaper than XYZ? So, and it's an easy question to answer, but I think it catches people off guard because we get a lot of price shoppers on the phone, and they'll say, wow, I just can't figure out why, you know, your direct cremation is $14.95, and why is Pierce Brothers, you know, Valley Oaks, why are they $7,000 for the same direct cremation? That's a huge difference. So, so I think it catches people off guard a little bit, you know?
So you kind of have to
Like-
do a little education with them, I guess, about the difference between, okay.
Yes. It really just comes down to business philosophy. I mean, this mortuary was founded on fair and transparency. And none of our staff are commissioned. I'm telling you, that is the key. Because all the other mortuaries, the staff are commissioned. So they have to sell $10,000 worth of caskets a week, for instance. Probably every director there does. And our staff do not have to do that. So it doesn't matter to us in an arrangement conference whether somebody chooses burial or cremation, and if they choose a really expensive casket or not, or they go home with a free urn that we give them. Do you know what I mean? So it's a lot of education, but it really is business philosophy here. We just feel like if we do what's right by our community, that our community will take care of us. And that has proven itself over and over.
So we haven't brought up, and I know you have to get going, but because you're shorthanded today and very busy, but I just was thinking about the Neptune Society. How do they play in this picture?
So I professionally, I never like try to talk about another mortuary or society by name, but I mean, I feel like I would be doing a disservice if I wasn't honest about what I've seen with the Neptune Society, especially over the last 2 years during the pandemic. But the Neptune Society is very popular, especially among older people. And I
Well,
believe,
Jennifer, they're popular. They send out that note consistently.
Yeah.
I know. So last time I checked, their direct cremation, exactly what we offer for $14.95. I believe their direct cremation was $2,500, and I bet it's gone up since then. So if your loved one has Neptune, Neptune is subcontracted with a bunch of removal companies. And so you're not getting individualized care, right? So you're calling an 800 number, and then some contracted removal company is going to come and pick you up. During the pandemic, Neptune decedents sat in their place of passing sometimes for days because Neptune never showed up to pick up the deceased. So that alone for me, like, I can't even imagine as a family member, like, you called and you're waiting for a 12, 16, 24, 48 hours for a removal company to show up. That to me was just like, so these families were calling us in utter panic. I have a Neptune arrangement, but they're not picking up. What can we do? So Neptune's contract is locked tight. Families cannot get out of it once they've paid for that. So we've had a couple of families do that, try to get out of it, but they just can't. So what they've ended up doing is abandoning their Neptune policy, taking that as a complete loss, and then having us take care of their arrangements. So I just would really, I mean, maybe it'll get better for Neptune since we're post-pandemic now. But really, they offer a direct cremation service and an urn, which some people really seem to be very relieved that they have their urn with them ahead of time. So literally dollar for dollar, it was $2,500. It may have gone up, and we're $1,495 for the absolute same service.
So, and I'm going to say this, that you brought this to my head, the pickup service. As a hospice nurse and being present when somebody has died and who picks up that body is not a light thing. It is really important who is picking up that body and how they treat the family, how they treat the body. And I can tell you, I've seen huge differences. And to me, that's important because you're leaving. That's part of the grieving process. That's part of the memory for that family.
We don't outsource those services for that very reason.
Yeah.
So you can only imagine what that looked like with us for 2 years, because my staff was just ragged. But we just do not outsource that because that's sacred work right there that they're doing. And when you have a removal company that's not your own staff, and they just don't do things the way we have, like procedurally, like what that looks like. We have a lead removal staff person, and then we have an assistant, and there's a whole process that goes on when a removal goes on. And the other thing that's really important that I don't think people think about, but when somebody passes and they come here to our care center. They're here with us. They don't leave here until burial takes place or cremation takes place. With a removal company or Neptune, they're taken to a warehouse down in LA somewhere. And I am not exaggerating that point. That is literally what it is. So I don't know. I just wouldn't want my loved one in a warehouse in Van Nuys somewhere. That just is not my idea of where I want them to go. So, and some people that might not matter, and that's great. But I think it's important to just talk about these things because I don't think that people know these things. It's like an industry that I always say, like, I'm an open book. You can ask me any question because I'm trying to demystify all the things that aren't talked about in the funeral industry. And I'm trying to just make it normalize the conversation so people become more comfortable talking about it.
It's so interesting because I thought I knew a lot, and after today, I'm not so sure I knew that much. So yeah, valuable information.
It's extremely valuable, and it would be good to do this again in person when we can and grow the audience and grow this to, again, I'm going to bring it back, and I just live on this cliff, I guess, of faith communities need to hear this information. I see that, the caregivers who would benefit from a lot of this information. So I see it, it's very important.
So
Jennifer,
I just want to add something. I'm sorry, I just wanted to
go
add
ahead,
something.
Denise.
First of all, I just want to say thank you, Jennifer. This has been an amazing talk. When we lost my dad, they had people pick him up, and he was a heavy man. And I remember, the last thing I remember is that they dropped him and how my sister was just mortified. And I never thought about it until I heard you talk about outsourcing. And it was like, it took me back to that moment.
Sorry.
And I just want to say thank you for sharing that, because
Mhm.
I'm going to call my sister after this meeting and let her know that that is not the norm. And
Yeah.
it was 2013, and it still just took me back to there. And I just want to say thank you for sharing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And sorry we brought that pain back up, Denise.
No, but
For sure.
it was one of those things where, like you said, you think you know everything, and I thought we were all good, but that was the one part, and we were all set up. Everything was, we had a plan, but what we didn't know is that we trusted, and we didn't. I wasn't really aware of that part, and just making sure you had the right person picking up that body, no matter how big they were. I think they should have known that when it was called in. That's the part. So
Wow.
thank you.
Yeah, to the degree that, when I take a removal call, there's a whole host of questions that we ask. And one of those questions is if there are any access issues at the place of pickup, if somebody's upstairs, or if there's narrow hallways, stairwells, apartment buildings without elevators, and then weight, of course. And our staff know sometimes, we're not given the accurate weight. And our staff plenty of times have called back and said, I need help here. And they know, do not do that removal. Let's get in help for you. And then you guys can do that removal together. So there's a lot of behind the scenes questions and work that goes on to make sure that that is a sacred, smooth, dignified process for the family.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, I have an odd question, and you can deny to answer it, but I'm curious, going from the American Cancer Society and what you've done, what brought you into this field?
So I was with the American Cancer Society for 17 years, and then their mission changed. And I saw them going more into a fundraising machine and less into mission work. And my heart is really in mission and community work. So then that's when I went to the Hospice Foundation, and I really wasn't planning on leaving. I wasn't looking when I left the Hospice Foundation, but the owner of Rose Family and I were friends, and for a long time. And then she just approached me one day and said, will you come work for me? So, and I was like, I don't know anything about the funeral industry. How will I possibly do this? So anyway, that's how it started 5 years ago. I've been here for 5 years.
So you didn't know it would be its own mission.
Yeah. And who, when you think about going from oncology to hospice to the funeral industry, it's kind of a natural progression. And all of those experiences in those other two areas are foundational to like who I am today and the work I do here, for sure.
Wow, I so appreciate it. And I appreciate your honesty and what you shared today. So thank you very much. This will be on the cloud when I get it on recording. We'll have Martha put it on the VCCCC website. To know that we are planning to have a meeting in July, and that I'll be working with Ken on that, and with Katie, who happens to be in the Dominion Republic. Excuse me for not being able to speak right. So look forward to that information, and for more that is coming up with the Ventura County Coalition for Compassionate Care. And also looking for a time that we can meet in person, and the possibility of being able to do that in somebody's locale. I think that would be great and important when we can do it. Thank you very, very much for your continued support. And I will say that if you are not a member, please consider doing that and going to our website, which is vcccc.org, and looking for membership information there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And stay well, believe me.
Right.